I had wanted to give a talk about the Jews in China and our experiences on several trips to China between 2014 and 2018. And we never quite got our act together to arrange for a talk at the Jewish Center of the Mauritius, and the pandemic hit. And then I decided, I could modify a talk that I had given before and make it just a slideshow and try to do it on Zoom. So you won't get to see some of the things that I would have handed out or handed around. On the other hand, you didn't have to travel too far to join this meeting. Before I start to do a screen share of the slides, and the bulk of this will be just pictures from our trips and a little bit of narrative to go with them. But before I do that, I want to share with you a little Torah teaching, because that's what I'm supposed to do. It's built into the title Rabbi that you're supposed to take the opportunity to share something of words of Torah. So the teaching I want to give today comes from this week's Torah portion. And actually, because I'm going to stall just a little bit because some people are still coming in, I'm going to teach you what we call Zoom Amen. And I'm going to start with a blessing, but let me teach you Zoom Amen. You take your left hand and hold it palm up, and take your right hand and swirl it around with the thumb up and plunk it down into the palm. So left hand up, right hand swirl around, plunk down is Zoom Amen. I think actually it's sign language Amen, but it works great when everybody is muted and you want to see that everybody is responding to a blessing. So I'm going to do a blessing for Torah study, and you're welcome to respond if you want. And then I'll share with you a Torah teaching. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So this week's Torah portion is filled with laws. In fact, its name is Mishpatim, so it really is referring to laws. And amidst all these many verses of laws is one verse. It's chapter 21 of the book of Exodus, verse 37. And it tells us that if a thief is caught having stolen an ox or a sheep, the thief has to pay restitution. There is a punishment, and the punishment is not just restoring that one animal that was stolen and slaughtered, but there's a multifold requirement to pay up. And the Torah tells us that the requirement to pay up is fourfold for a sheep and fivefold for an ox. And of course, the rabbis say, well, why the difference between a sheep and an ox? So there are two explanations that are given. The first is that the ox is a laboring animal. It does work, and work is considered to be of great value in Jewish tradition. And we're blessed with a Sabbath one day of the week, but the other 6 days of the week, we're not supposed to be couch potatoes or Zoom potatoes or whatever. We're supposed to be working. And working can be on behalf of making the world a better place, but we're supposed to be doing something with this gift of life. And life is extremely precious. That's the reason why we are being careful with washing hands and keeping some distance from people and wearing masks. And because life is so precious, we treat it carefully, but we're supposed to use our lives. And so when an ox is stolen, there's a slightly higher penalty to tell us about how important labor is. But there's another explanation that's given, and that is when the thief steals the sheep, it's usually the case that the thief has to carry the sheep on his shoulder or her shoulder. Whereas if the thief steals an ox, the ox can be led away and the ox can transport itself on its own 4 feet. So the punishment for stealing the sheep is a little bit less, because the thief had to be a little bit undignified in the process of making the theft, and there was already some punishment involved in stealing the sheep. So you don't have to pay quite the same penalty as if you steal an ox. And why is that important? Because human dignity is invaluable. And we respect humans as being made in God's image. And that's true even of the thief. So we don't subject the thief to additional punishment when the thief already had some punishment of being undignified in the process of carrying the sheep out. So now a quiz question for you. Why did I center on this verse about ox in the course of selecting a Torah teaching for this week's Torah portion? And I see a hand up. So I'm going to guess that if your hand is up, you know the answer to this. And that is that tonight begins the Chinese New Year, and this is the year of the ox. So that was my very, very weak attempt at linking this week's Torah portion to the topic at hand. Let me share with you a little bit of additional information. Today, February 11th, the United States Postal Service issued a new stamp. And now you can raise your hand if you know what the stamp was. So the stamp was issued, I believe, in honor of International Women and Girls in Science Day. And the stamp has a picture of a woman whose name was, well, she's often known in physics circles as Madame Wu. I think her name was probably Chiang-Shung Wu, but she was a physicist who was of tremendous value to the field of experimental physics, such that I think she is one of those women who was robbed of a Nobel Prize. She really should have received the Nobel Prize. But she is being honored, or was honored today, with a stamp issued in with her picture on it. And I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but tonight it begins Chinese New Year. So this stamp was issued today, International Women and Girls in Science, and you can see what Madame Wu looked like. By the way, I do link physics and Judaism, as you probably know. And in my career at Los Alamos National Laboratory, for many years, one of my colleagues was Madame Wu's son, who is also a physicist. So I had some kind of second order connection to the woman who was honored with the stamp today. Speaking of honor and respect, I have a few caveats, and they are as follows. I have a lot of respect for the Chinese people. I'm not trying to purport to be an expert on this subject whatsoever. I was quite taken by my experiences of being in China 7 times over the course of 2014 to 2018. It was a tremendous honor for me to work with the expat congregation in Beijing. I'll tell you a little bit about how that came about as soon as we get to the slides. But I'm not an expert on China. I'm not an expert on the Jews of China. I'm not an expert on that congregation either, though I had the privilege to work with them on a number of occasions. And I do, because of this respect for the Chinese and for all human beings, I hope that I don't say anything or do anything this evening that is taken as being disrespectful. I wore a red tie. I don't know if you can really see that, but I wore a red tie because it is Chinese New Year, and I think that is one of the traditions. But I'm not trying to adopt traditions that are not mine and be disrespectful in any way. And I did choose to hold this talk tonight deliberately, but I also know that under normal circumstances, this would be a celebratory night for those who are observing Chinese New Year, and you know, I wasn't trying to commandeer that in any way. Okay, having said all that, Let me go to my screen share, and Beverly will speak up if I mess this up. But let's just see how this works. All right. And I think you should now have a screen share, and we'll be doing slides for the next 40 plus minutes, I would imagine. And then we'll open this up for questions. So just sit tight with your questions. You may have some. I'll try to be zipping through a bunch of this. We've titled this Jews in China, Itinerant Rabbi-ing for Beijing's Expatriate Community. The picture you see are some kippot, and those are kippot from the congregation that I served, Kehillat Beijing. You can read about that congregation by going to their very cleverly named website, which is synagogue.org, I believe, SINOGOGUE, very clever pun on China, Sino, and Gog, synagogue, but it's synagogue. In any case, those are the kippot that they have. And if you look at the characters on there, they were very creative with this symbol here, where they've replaced what would normally be in this spot with a Jewish star. It's a little hard to see in this photograph, but I really like those kippot, and I have a few of them as souvenirs. I had another title for this talk that Beverly said is just too complicated, but I enjoy this pun so much that I kept this in as a backup title. So this is called Hi Ho at the Ho Hi. And what is that all about? So Hi Ho is rabbinic shorthand for the high holidays. And there you see a shofar on the left. And Ho Hai is the name of one of the lakes in Beijing. And you see it pictured on the right. And to me, it looks like a shofar. So I just thought that was really cute. Hi Ho at the Ho Hai. And that's what we experienced was traveling for the high holidays to Beijing. So let me go on. Here's a map of China. It's kind of a tourist map, if you will. You certainly couldn't travel around with this one. I put a scale on there roughly of 1,000 miles being, a chunk of that. But you see here, it's a large country, by the way. I knew precisely nothing. Actually, I knew negative about China before we went there, because what little I knew was totally wrong. So let me just not presuppose that you know a lot about China or its Jews, but there may be some experts on here on this call, on this Zoom talk. So I apologize in advance if I get this messed up. But anyway, Beijing is here. And I'm also going to show you some pictures from a trip that we took up to Harbin, which is way up here in the north. I'm also going to show some pictures that we took in Xi'an, which is here, and some pictures, that Beverly took in Chengdu, which is here. And those are really the only cities that we traveled to in China. So I'm not going to show you anything about Shanghai or any of these other places, but I'm going to leave this picture up for a little bit because I'm going to use this picture for the history of the Jews in China. And then the rest of this talk is really going to be a slideshow. So I'll point out some cities that aren't listed here, but right around where my laser pointer is, that's where the city of Kaifeng is. And so I'll begin by talking a little bit about Kaifeng. By the way, Jews and China doesn't seem like a particularly rich topic for study. There were relatively isolated communities of Jews between the 7th and the 13th centuries of the Common Era during what were called the Tang and the Song dynasties. And those isolated communities then continued through the Qing dynasty, the 19th century. And the most notable of these isolated communities was in Kaifeng, which, as I said, is roughly where the laser pointer is. This is a result of the Silk Road. Now, if you want to read an interesting novel about the Jews of Kaifeng, I recommend Peony by Pearl Buck. If you want to read a little bit more about the Silk Road and the history of Jews in China from one person's research and personal anecdotes, I recommend a book called Pepper, Silk, and Ivory by Rabbi Marvin Tokayer. And then just one more book so I don't forget it. I'll tell a little bit about the history of the Jews in Shanghai in the later period, and that was the just pre-Holocaust period. If you want to read a memoir from that period, I recommend a book called 10 Green Bottles by Vivian Kaplan. It goes without saying that I'm a book lover, and so those are just 3 books that I thought you might find interesting on this topic. So what about Kaifeng? Kaifeng was granted residence for Jews by the Tang Emperor, and those Jews largely came from Babylonia and Persia, so the modern day Iraq and Iran, and they were part of that Silk Road, and they established a distinct community in Kaifeng. And many of those individuals went on to become government officials, doctors, businessmen. They largely assimilated into Chinese culture. I'm going to show you a little about that, I think, on a slide just very shortly. And they kind of intermarried with the Han Chinese, and largely they have disappeared, I would say. Again, I'm not trying to be political at all. But the synagogue that they built, which was around for roughly 700 years, that synagogue kind of disappeared in about 1860. So we know a lot about that community and about that history, but they were very isolated for quite a long time. In the early 19th and 20th century, there was more trade now between Jewish merchants and China, particularly in the port cities. And you see Hong Kong down here and Shanghai as port cities. Hong Kong being a British colony at the time, Shanghai having an international settlement and French concession. And then also there was settlement in Harbin way up here as part of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And the first wave of Jews into Shanghai came in the second half of the 19th century, and those were Mizrahi Jews from Iraq. And then roughly the first half of the 20th century is when Jews came into Harbin up here, mostly fleeing the 1917 Russian Revolution. Many white Russians fled to Harbin, and at one time, that numbered about 20,000 Jews in Harbin. That was a large Jewish community in China. And they played a key role in local politics, in the economy, and in international trade. There were also Russian Jews who settled in Tianjin, which I think is down here, not too far from Beijing, but on the water. Then, as I said, the Shanghai Jews had an influx of another roughly 18,000 Jews coming from Germany, Austria, and Poland just before the gates shut in those countries in the late 1930s and early 1940s. Most of those Jews lived in a ghetto. They had very harsh conditions. You can read about them from 10 Green Bottles. But those people were not executed. The Chinese have not had a history of anti-Semitism. Those people they were malnourished, they were, impoverished, but they didn't really suffer what they would have suffered had they stayed in Germany, Austria, or Poland. Notice what I left out of this discussion, namely Beijing, because Beijing really didn't have much of a Jewish community until China reopened in 1979. And that's when Jewish life really returned to Beijing. There were a few isolated individuals, Jewish individuals in Beijing before that, but the establishment of the congregation, Kehillat Beijing, really took place in 1979. So I mentioned Kaifeng. This is I copied the cover and the title page of a reprint of a Haggadah that was printed in Kaifeng in the 17th or 18th century. And here you see this kind of artist rendition of Jews with the Torah scroll. And this is in what's called a teak. It's not the way that Ashkenazic Jews are familiar with having an ark and you take the Torah out of the ark. This is more of a wooden, typically a wooden case, and the Torah is contained inside that case, but the case can be opened. So you see here some Jews who are looking at this Torah scroll, but these Jews have clearly assimilated to some extent because, at least to my eye, they look fairly Chinese in this artist's rendition. And that's really what happened with the Jewish community of Kaifeng. So let me now turn to the slideshow, which I know is what is a little closer to my area of expertise, because this was our experience, not my attempt at trying to summarize something about the Jews of China historically. This was 2014, our first trip to China. How did this come about? I was searching for a congregation that would be in an interesting place that didn't have a rabbi. I sent off about 20 email messages to congregations. And when I hit send on the one to Beijing, I said to Beverly, we'll never hear from them. And a few weeks later, we got an email back, and it was that congregation saying, you know, it turns out we're looking for somebody to come in for high holidays this year. We might want to talk. And we ended up having a Zoom call, which was, no, it was a Skype call actually. But you know, that was a big deal in those days, you know, hard to believe. But we had that conversation, and it sounded like it would be a good fit, and we thought we would give it a try. So we went off for 3.5 weeks on that first trip. We came out several days before Rosh Hashanah, and we stayed into the holiday of Sukkot. So we were there for quite a while. It was a long trip for us. We were coming from Los Alamos. Our flight, so you have to drive from Los Alamos to Denver, fly to Albuquerque, then fly to Denver, then fly to San Francisco. And so this is the board where we finally got to San Francisco, and we see Beijing on the board, which was a really nice thing, because once we got on that plane, I could finally get some rest. I think we left at 2 in the morning on a Wednesday and didn't get into Beijing until 3 in the afternoon on Thursday. So quite a grueling experience, but it's a small Jewish world. When I got invited to go to Beijing, a woman got in touch with me from Beijing and said, since you're going to be out here, would you conduct a wedding for my son? He's getting married. And it turns out that her friend, who lived in Albuquerque, made the ketubah as a paper cut, met us at the airport in Albuquerque, and we schlepped the ketubah with us. That's going to play a role later on. So that's the reason that I'm mentioning that. This is just our first sight of China, the immigration inspection at the airport. And that's about it for Genesis. By the way, I structured this talk around the 5 books of Moses. So the Genesis was really supposed to be, how did this trip come about? Exodus is going to be more or less transporting ourselves. And this is one of our modes of transportation. And here you see me and Beverly. You can tell it's us because we're wearing helmets, because we were terrified of being on bicycles in Beijing. Most everybody else is without a helmet. But it was a very wonderful experience to ride around and to get to see some of the sights of China on a bicycle. I thoroughly enjoyed it, but I was a bit terrified, I have to say. So that is the beginning of one mode of transportation. Here's another mode of transportation that's not the bicycle that we use, but you do see things like this all around. You also see bicycles like this one. This has two sets of handlebars. Don't ask me why that is. No seat, however. And you see people transported around like this, a wicker basket carrying a child. I thought that was quite interesting. Here's a three-wheeled motor vehicle that's enclosed. That's pre-pandemic, but think of the wonders of having plexiglass surrounding you when you've got a virus floating around. Here's another three-wheeled vehicle doing a lot of transport. Quite a variety of mechanisms for transporting things. Here are some motorized scooters, and you can see that you can carry not one, but two trees on a motorized scooter if you're careful about it. You can also get into one of these bicycle rickshaws, and we took a few rides in those. And it looks like many of them now have battery assist, so it's not quite so taxing on the driver. Here you see an enterprising person with a pretty high load on the back of a three-wheel vehicle. I have to say, we saw some things that did not seem to follow OSHA, but we saw some things that brought us right back home again. Notice the Walmart sign there, and some things that then took us way back in the history. As we're walking around or riding bicycles around, we saw this. Actually, it was our destination. What is it? It's an ancient observatory. And it was in Beijing when the skies were clear. So I don't think this is a modern observatory. In fact, you'd be hard pressed to be able to see too many stars in Beijing on a normal evening. But at one time, Beijing had an observatory, an ancient observatory. And of course, we went to that because as a physicist, I wanted to find out more about this observatory. It was actually a fascinating exhibit. It showed some very sophisticated equipment because the Chinese had a great interest and expertise in science, as you probably know. And I thought that that was a fascinating museum for us to go to. Beverly went. I would say maybe it wasn't quite as fascinating for her, but nevertheless, she was a good trooper about that. Here, another sign of modern life. If you look carefully, you can see there's a Starbucks coffee right there. Can't go too far without that. But it's not just coffee that you can get in China. Of course, you can get tea. And here is the largest teapot I'd ever seen. That's a, what do you call it? An apiary, is that right? I can't remember now. But a sculpted bush or bushes made into a teapot. Here's some more enterprising people. This is somebody getting a haircut out on the street. And if that isn't enough, here's something that we saw in multiple places, people getting their ears cleaned at a sidewalk stand, something that you don't see in Patchogue. At least I don't think you see it in Patchogue. Here's another vehicle, one that's carrying coal around in the village where we stayed for several nights. And that's part of that sky problem in Beijing, burning coal in these houses as a way to keep warm, something we don't see so often around here anymore. But here's somebody shoveling coal into the coal bins in the little houses in that village. And yet you do get some beautiful views. I believe this is actually Xi'an and not Beijing. On our first trip, because we had some days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we took a detour and went off to Xi'an because the only thing I wanted to see outside of providing support for the Jewish community in Beijing was I wanted to see those warriors in Xi'an. So we went to Xi'an, and it happened to be over the national holiday, and everything was lit up beautifully. I have to say it was quite a sight to behold. That's not the only beautiful sight we saw. This is in Beijing again. This is the largest LED screen in Asia, I believe. It's enormous. It's in a shopping mall in Beijing, and you can actually pay to have a message put up there like I propose to you or something like that. But when we happened to be there, there were no proposals being made. Rather, it was just a very nice display. I will tell you that we saw a lot of people wearing masks, which was such a strange experience in 2014. Of course, times have changed. Now we see people wearing masks all the time. But that came back to haunt us at this screen, as it's called, because our host one evening in Beijing said, I'll meet you at the screen and then take you to dinner and take you to the lecture hall where you're going to give a talk. And I thought, okay, I know what she looks like. We saw her in the shul. And then it happened to be really bad air the day that we were supposed to meet her. And everybody was wearing a mask, which made it almost impossible for us to find her. But of course, she found us, so that worked out okay. Here's another beautiful sight, upscale malls. We saw upscale stuff everywhere. Here's an upscale Apple store in Beijing. But maybe some things not so upscale. Here's some construction taking place in that village that we stayed in Beijing. And yet here's a construction project that's really, really old and amazing technological feat. This is the Great Wall of China. We had a wonderful experience walking up to it because it happened to be Shabbat and we chose to walk. And then rather than take the cable car down, we tobogganed down, which was a tremendous experience. We really enjoyed that. This is the interior of the place that we stayed in Beijing for many nights. It looks like an old village, but this interior has been totally renovated and it was a really, really lovely place. And here's the old with the new. I just enjoyed this, seeing these curved roofs everywhere that makes me feel like I'm in China. And yet in the background are many of these 40-story tall apartment buildings because there's a lot of people in Beijing, let me tell you. And then I think I'm gonna have several quick pictures that I'm gonna zip through here. These are all from the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. So we arrived, as I said, completely exhausted on Thursday afternoon, and we were met at the airport by our host and taken to her apartment that you saw a picture of. And then she told us, after we kind of took showers and felt semi-human, that the next morning we would be picked up at 7 in the morning to go over to see the Temple of Heaven. And I thought, that's ridiculous. Why would we want to be over there at 7 in the morning? Well, it turns out that those people knew much more than we knew. First of all, there's a lot to see there at 7 in the morning. And second of all, the jet lag hit us and we were awake long before 7. So what is it that you see in the Temple of Heaven? All the retirees go there to well, so I missed one there. This is a retiree doing calligraphy. This is a retiree playing some stringed instrument, retirees singing, retirees playing some card game, doing some martial arts. And what is this all about? The retirees generally go to the park when the weather is decent and can do their outdoor activities and exercises. And then they go back home and they're taking care of the kids while the parents go off to work. So a multi-generational household, something that unfortunately I think we've largely lost in our society, but something very important still in China. And you only get to see those retirees doing all their activities early in the morning because they need to go on childcare duty when the parents go off to work. So that's it for Exodus. Let me go on to Leviticus. Leviticus is all about religious type things. And this is one of those religions. These are prayer wheels. And we went to the Lama Temple in Beijing, fascinating place. But there was another linkage to Buddhism that was really important for us. And I show that here. I was even able to do some animation for this talk. I'm glad that seemed to work. This is the card that I carried around in my wallet everywhere we went, because when we would go into a restaurant, Beverly and I are vegetarian and keep kosher. And the best thing is for us just to eat Buddhist. And it doesn't mean we eat Buddhist people. It means that we eat like Buddhist people, and we don't eat dishes with any meat products. And so we actually often ate at Buddhist restaurants, which were closely located to the Buddhist temples. But if we didn't happen to be at a Buddhist restaurant, then we would go to a restaurant and use these cards. Now, I can't tell you that what we got was really right, but we did the best we could with that card. Now, here's another religion that we happen to see in China. This is in Xi'an, and you can see this gentleman is wearing this white hat. That is a Muslim. Xi'an has a Muslim population in it, and here is a woman with her head covered, another Muslim woman in Xi'an, and that's a presence there that I was unaware of. Of course, there are multiple religions that are permitted in China. Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Protestant, and Catholics are the officially recognized religions. At least that's my understanding. Judaism is not one of those religions, but Judaism serves the expat community. And so from that point of view, it's allowed. I think it would be a problem to do any proselytizing. So it's not like you're going to have a lot of Chinese people walking in off the street into the shul. This is, I don't know why I threw this in here, except that I had wonderful memories in there. We went to the city of Harbin on a different trip. So again, between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur was our opportunity to leave Beijing. We went to Harbin because of its great Jewish community in the early 20th century. And Harbin is in the frozen north, and it's most famous for this ice festival, but we were there during the high holidays, so there's no ice festival. But they have a refrigerated warehouse where they have some ice sculptures on display, and there's an ice sculpture of the Statue of Liberty. But more important for Harbin is the Jewish heritage that I want to share with you a little bit. And you see many signs up in Harbin that say this building originally run by a Jew. And you see lots of these in the downtown area. And what you also see are two synagogues in Harbin. This one has been turned into a museum. And so everything that you see displayed there is a museum display, but that's the best view we could get of the synagogue proper. There's a view of one of the windows. You can see the Jewish star in the window. And here's the Jewish star from outside. So there's two synagogues in Harbin. One of them is this museum, and one of them is now some kind of a performing arts amphitheater. There is no Jewish community in Harbin anymore that I know of. Beverly and I also took an excursion to the Jewish cemetery in Harbin to pay our respects there. There's a very large Jewish cemetery in Harbin. Now we're in Beijing, and I'm going to close out the book of Leviticus with religious experiences from Beijing. There is the Chabad house in Beijing. And I said that Judaism is not a recognized religion. And so the Chabad house is really a restaurant. And you can see here, it says kosher restaurant, Dini's kosher restaurant. She's the wife of the Chabad rabbi. And it just happens to be a synagogue as well, but it's really a restaurant open to the public. And we went there many times to worship. For example, the Beijing community that I supported only did one day of Rosh Hashanah. And so the second day of Rosh Hashanah, Beverly and I went to Chabad. And other holidays that are not observed by the more progressive or liberal congregation that I supported, we would go to Chabad instead. This is the inside of the Chabad synagogue. And what they've done is a beautiful thing in the back here with these stained glass windows of synagogues around China, many of which don't exist anymore, but they have the beautiful collection of those stained glass windows. And their calendar that came out, at least that year, had each month as one of those pictures. And so we got a copy of that calendar. I thought it was beautiful. This now is the worship space that we used. This is actually a communal space that was rented by the synagogue in Beijing, Kehillat Beijing. You see here the ark. It's a Chinese ark, if you will. It's a Chinese box that's been repurposed as an ark. And the chairs are movable because this room is used by others for other purposes. But every Friday evening, certain Saturday mornings, the Jewish holidays, this was used by Kehillat Beijing. Right now, and I don't know if this is because of the pandemic or what, they're meeting in somebody's house. But this was a very nice worship space that we used. There's a brochure from Kehillat Beijing, and here you can see the symbols for Kehillat Beijing with that Jewish star like on the kippah. This is yours truly with the ark open and the Torah exposed. It's actually a tricky ark for a Torah because you had to lift the Torah out through the top half. It was a little bit awkward, I have to say, but it worked. Here's rolling the Torah in to the right spot. And as I say, they have this Torah scroll, which was really nice. Now you could move those chairs around. And one of the beauties of Kehillat Beijing is that almost every single event is coupled with a communal meal. And I have to say, I think that's a brilliant idea. I long for the return to communal meals. And I urge every synagogue to use that as a method of bringing people in. I thought it worked extremely effectively for Kehillat Beijing. I told you that I gave a lecture. This is a lecture in the Moshe House. I had never really learned much about Moshe houses until being in Beijing. They exist all around the world. There are roughly 100 of these, many of them in the United States, but many of them elsewhere. And they are sort of targeted at the post-Hillel age, so kind of post-college single scene. And the way this one worked is that it's an apartment that's subsidized by the Moshe House organization. The people who live there get a discount on their rent, and in return, they have to host Jewish events periodically. And it's particularly targeted at the kind of 20-somethings and 30-somethings. And I gave a couple, actually over the years, I've given probably half a dozen talks to the Moshe House on various topics. This is a retreat home owned by one of the families from Kehillat Beijing, where we did a retreat almost every trip that I took to Beijing. And it was really lovely to be able to use that retreat home as a base for retreat experiences, which I think are wonderful community building experiences. Here you see me reading a story is my sort of familiar approach to things. Here you see me blowing the shofar, teaching kids how to blow the shofar. This must have been pre-Rosh Hashanah. And then here's me teaching somebody how to use the lulav and etrog, because as I say, we stayed through Sukkot with this one family in Beijing. Now, I mentioned the ketubah. I did do a wedding in Beijing. The thing you see here is what we schlepped, but not all the text was filled in. Here you see me pointing out to the Chinese scribe where he's going to have to put some text. And here he is practicing because he was terrified that he would mess this thing up. And here he is filling in Chinese in the spot in the ketubah where the Hebrew says something that's specific to this couple, namely when they got married, where they got married. So you see, he had to go fill in the blanks with the specifics. And this is this beautiful paper cut ketubah that we carried with us from Albuquerque to Beijing. This is from their wedding, food-themed Jewish wedding in China. These are the spoons that we got for as guests at the wedding. This is the ketubah. And I have to tell you, this was the most beautiful wedding I think I ever officiated at. We did Havdalah to start it off because it was a Saturday night wedding. There you see the kippot that were used with red, and that's the kippah I happen to be wearing right now. So I'm going through Havdalah. And there is the wedding picture itself with me officiating the bride and the groom. What a great experience. This groom, by the way, was the first bar mitzvah in Beijing, probably in millennia. When he was 13, he had his bar mitzvah, and I happened to be there for his wedding. Numbers, the book of Numbers, is going to be devoted to numbers, as it says in its title, sheer quantity. 1.4 billion people or so in China. Cities of 8 million are referred to as mid-tier cities, not big cities. Those are mid-tier cities. Xi'an, just kind of a mid-tier city, right? So here's, the numbers, all those warriors. I just thought, that was what I really wanted to see in Xi'an. But we saw lots of other large quantities of people. This is people preparing for that National Day celebration where they're going to be doing some kind of a dance, preparing it by practicing. We happened to stumble on that. Numbers in terms of food, I thought was wonderful as well. Every imaginable food on a stick, cake on a stick, right? You only buy one little bite of cake. What a great diet program. Here is dragon fruit, is that right? I think that, no, this is, I'm sorry, correct me, I've gone blank.
I think Georgian, the one that smells.
Say it again.
The stinky fruit, durian?
Durian, right, durian, sorry, that's right, durian. I'm sorry, I just went blank on that. That's durian. Yeah, we saw lots of things that we didn't know. There's the dragon fruit. And we really enjoyed the dragon fruit. I have to say, the durian, maybe not quite so much. But there, as New Mexicans at the time going to China, we couldn't resist looking at red and green chilies. That's for you New Mexicans there. But lots of outdoor markets. There's a turtle being sold, maybe not my favorite food on a stick. There's bagels, right? You can't go anywhere without bagels. That was a retreat event where we had bagels. But here's sunflowers and chestnuts, just foods galore. The numbers really are staggering because you're feeding a lot of people in Beijing and in China. This, I thought, was a delicious dessert that we watched being made. You're really lost if you can't read. That's why that wallet card was so important. Here's somebody making quail eggs into little omelets, I guess. Here's somebody making some kind of puffed corn dessert or corn snack, I think. Just lots and lots of food in these markets, food on sticks. There's a place we went to where we knew we could get away with the menu because the menu was both in Hebrew and Chinese. It's a place called Bita Pita, run by some Israelis in Beijing. And here was a tea shop in the tea market in Beijing. We were treated to that by a couple. This couple subsequently got married, and I was pleased to be honored with officiating at their wedding celebration, actually here in the United States. They came back to the United States, but they treated us to an afternoon in the tea market. Now, numbers is one thing, but size is something else. We did not see this wandering around in the streets. This is in a reserve in Chengdu. No, Harbin. This was in Harbin. But then I couldn't resist in Chengdu. We went to Chengdu not because of its Jewish sites, but because of its pandas. I just couldn't resist taking pictures or having Beverly take pictures of these guys. You know, this guy, what, isn't that heaven? Sit there and eat and let the detritus end up on your lap. What more could you ask for out of life? So Chengdu, there is a synagogue. There's a Chabad in Chengdu. But we went there largely to see these animals and to visit with a friend of ours from Los Alamos who was at the State Department consulate in Chengdu at the time. This is a weak representative of a panda. These are called red pandas, I think. They're also at that same place in Chengdu, but not quite as entertaining. And then to close this out, Deuteronomy, to kind of wrap up, Here you see Rabbi Jack at a bookstore. You can't take the, you can take me out of Brooklyn, but you can't take Brooklyn. I don't know, whatever that phrase is, but you can't, have me pass a bookstore, even though I could hardly read anything in there, but I wanted to go to the bookstore. And here you see me with my nose buried in a map of Beijing, but I think this might be the Hohai Lake. So I just wanted you to see that it really does exist in Beijing. What I also wanted to do to conclude is that you really are better served if you learn a little bit of Chinese. And we saw great attempts at giving us English. It wasn't always the same English that we're used to seeing. This was in a bathroom. This is what I've always wanted to talk to you. Flushing timely, you are the best. This was part of a campaign to get people to use bathrooms in a sort of Western style. You can see this toilet is a Western style toilet. And we saw other signs that just didn't quite translate. Sometimes people call this Chinglish, let's marry afternoon tea, look out, knock head, not exactly the way we would phrase it. On the other hand, a hell of a lot better than I would do with Mandarin. So, I really give people credit for trying on this. And, try wandering around the United States and thinking what happens if you can't read English. You're toast. So, I think they did a very good job helping us out, but you can actually buy books of Chinglish that are just interesting phrases. This one I really liked, actually. One small step ahead, one giant leap for civilization. This is a urinal. So I think, again, part of that campaign to keep things a little bit cleaned up. Here's a place where reading signs can get you into trouble. Here we see this picture of Haifa Plaza. No, it's not Haifa. We're not in Israel here. It's Haifa, I believe. And it just threw me off to see that on the sign. So that's going to close this out. The swan song, if you will, is kites in the air, sort of our view, nostalgic view of China, meaning that we enjoyed our time there. We would love to go back. And again, everything is done up big. There's kites galore, all on one string at the Hohai Lake as we made our departure from China. And there we are saying goodbye. And that's it. So I want to thank you for your attention. I'll urge you again to stay healthy. I wish you, if you're observing Chinese New Year, good New Year, Shana Tova. The photos are, as I said, all courtesy of Beverly. And with that, I think I will stop my screen share if I know how to do that. And we can unmute and take some questions. Thank you for your attention, by the way.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're right.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Great Peony.
I have a question. I'm sorry. I have a question,
Go
by the way.
ahead.
Rabbi,
Yes, Doug.
I have a question. So what's the population of Jews in China overall?
I don't know about Jews in China. I think they say in Beijing there might be on the order of 2,000 Jews, give or take. And I see a question. It's an excellent question in the chat, or yeah, I guess it's in the chat about the Jewish population in Beijing. I meant to mention that. I apologize. So it started out as business people coming over to Beijing when China opened up in 1979. And sort of entrepreneurial people looking for opportunities. So there were some business people who were there. There's always a Jewish contingent in the State Department. And so the Jews in the U.S. The U.S. Embassy in Beijing, and also in the Israeli consulate. So those are also part of the population. And then many, many, many young people who graduate from college, maybe having learned some Chinese, wanting to know if they can exercise that experience and go off for a year or two and maybe teach English, but have an interesting experience in China. So the Kehillat Beijing population is largely young people. It's largely people in their 20s and 30s. They're there in an itinerant way. You get to be good friends with them, and the next year they're gone and it's a new population. So the old standbys get a year older. Those are kind of the business people who've really made names for themselves and really felt they've put roots down. But a lot of the people come and go, and it makes the community tighter knit because people know that they have to make friends quickly. The people in the State Department, of course, get cycled out in 3 years or so. So they come and go. So again, roughly 2,000 Jews at any given time in Beijing is the estimate. We get tourists that come through, Jewish tourists come through, and what else? You know, just sort of other people who just happen to be in Beijing. I think one of the things that happens is if you're Jewish and then you're in New York City, you don't need to identify as Jewish because Jews are all over the place. But if you're a Westerner and a Jew to boot, and you find yourself in a city of 20 million people, all of whom basically are Chinese, you somehow feel this need to link with people that you recognize, if you will. And so people who hadn't done much with synagogues suddenly feel the need to connect with the Jewish community in Beijing. So that's a bit about Beijing. There's probably maybe another few thousand Jews in China altogether. I wouldn't think there's that many Jews in China. There was another question that I thought I wanted to answer, but let's see. Let me try to do these in order so that I don't leave anybody out. So
There's a hand up also, Mara.
oh, yeah. Mara, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, thank you, Rabbi. You sort of half answered my question already, but you may not know the full answer, but I was struck by something you said back when Jews initially settled in Kaifeng, that they were granted permission to settle there, and that struck me as reminiscent of Jews in the Middle Ages in Europe. But you also said that there was no history of anti-Semitism in China, so my initial question was, why did they need permission? Was it because they were Jews or just because that's Chinese culture?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think we're talking about the Middle Ages where that permission was granted. So I certainly don't know much about it. When I say there wasn't much of a history of persecution or any that I know of Jews in China, certainly in the Middle Ages, it was nothing like, ghettoized or restricted in the way that we're used to reading about for Ashkenazic Jews. So I think they were quite successful in Kaifeng, but, with an emperor, it's not like, freedom for everybody. I can imagine that just was the process. But I never read about anything that made it sound like it was particularly a harsh situation. I hope that answers that, and we can talk offline because I have a few resources. Again, I didn't have all my books with me because we only moved 3,500 books to New York, and the other 3,500 are in storage in New Mexico. So I wasn't able to access everything. I see there was a question about cave dwellers. No, we didn't really have that many tourist opportunities. I showed some of that in the slides just because that was where we took pictures. But I was there on the generous contribution or payment, if you will, from Kehillat Beijing, and I tried to serve the community. I did a baby naming, some weddings, multiple weddings in Beijing. Taught bat mitzvah student, did some counseling, not professional counseling. I am not a professional counselor, but I did some counseling to people. No funerals. There really were no old people that we dealt with because, as I say, the congregation is largely a young congregation. So fortunately, no funerals to deal with, but lots of activities. I tried to teach as many things as I could teach when I was there. So no, we did not see the cave dwellers, and I need to go back and be really more of a tourist. Let's see. Was there another hand up? I don't know, but I have a question here about the high holiday services. So the congregation has some books. They have, it's a high holiday book that I wasn't familiar with. It's done through B'nai B'rith, I think. I'd never used it before, and I haven't used it outside of Beijing. I acquired a copy of it in advance of the first high holidays, and then tried to build my service around it. But it was what I would call kind of conservative light. Again, sort of what we're comfortable with, Beverly and me personally are comfortable with, of a mix of Hebrew and English, and trying to do a lot of participatory stuff. But I augmented it with a lot of other readings as well to make it my service and not just following something in that book.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can I ask?
Yes,
you a
Anne,
question?
go ahead.
Somewhere I had read that many Jews escaped Germany and went to China before the Holocaust.
Yes, that is true. There were about 18,000 Jews who managed to escape Germany, Austria, and Poland and go to Shanghai. It was a very narrow window, the late 1930s and early 1940s. And Beverly, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think before the pandemic, you and I went to an exhibition in the Brooklyn branch of the New York City Public Library that was about the Jews of Shanghai from that period. I think that was a very, very, desperate thing for Jews to get out at that period. And Shanghai was gracious enough to admit about almost 20,000 Jews. The Japanese tried to impose pretty harsh conditions, but the Chinese had no history of torturing Jews or anything like that. So it just was it was a difficult period in those people's lives. They were hungry, they were cold, they were crowded, they were poor, but they were not really tortured or anything like that. I hope that answers your question.
Did they stay there, or did they all leave?
Oh, that's an excellent question, Anne. I have read of families where it took them roughly 10 years before they were able to leave. And so many of them were there for quite a while, didn't get out until roughly 1950 or so. Many of those people then went on to Israel.
Rabbi,
After 1948, then Israel became a place that would welcome, any Jews, of course.
Rabbi,
There was a question here about Asian Jews, like the East Asian Jews in India. I don't know of anybody like that. I think you'd have to ask somebody more expert on this topic. And about a recorded version. So yes, Beverly, I think recorded this and will make it available probably through the Jewish Center of the Marich's website. Excuse me, and also through my own website that Beverly maintains, which is www.physicsrabbi.com. Is that right? I think that's right. Let's see.
Rabbi, regarding the Shanghai Jews, if I may, on the 21st, there will be an exhibit, a show webinar from the Museum of Jewish Heritage on the Shanghai Jews.
Wonderful.
I believe at 2:00 in the afternoon. And by the way, by 1940, in 1949, when the communists took over, except for a very few devoted Marxists, all the European Jews were expelled, those who had not left after 45.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't think it was so easy to leave in 45 because you still had to have somewhere to go.
Right.
But then you're probably right. And I think because Israel became a country in 1948, the timing would probably be about right that those people could certainly go to Israel if nowhere else.
Rabbi?
And then hang on one second, because I want to get this question. There was a question about foreigners, if it was like Japan only being allowed in 2 areas segregated from the rest of the Japanese people in the cities of Nagasaki and Yokohama, the Jews in Shanghai who came in late 40s, late 30s, early 40s, they were segregated into a neighborhood. That's my understanding. But again, didn't experience any of the atrocities that we associate with the Shoah.
Rabbi,
And now go ahead. Yes.
Oh, in Shanghai, we were in China for 3 weeks about 8 years ago, and in Shanghai, Michael Blumenthal was there.
the treasurer,
The
secretary of the
painter
treasurer.
Peter Max lived there, and so did Lawrence Tribe, the Harvard lawyer. And China and Shanghai was the only country that freely admitted Jews during the Second World War. They asked something like 38 countries if they would accept Jews, and Shanghai was the only country that said it would.
At the Avion
Yes.
Conference.
Right.
But
Thank
we've
you.
also-
But I do believe it was just for this small window
Yes.
that
Oh, yes.
Jews could
There was
get out.
Wonderful
Right.
book that we just read at the synagogue book group at Tiferet Israel. It's called The Last Kings of Shanghai. It's excellent about the Sassoons and the Kaduris who are
Iranian Jews.
Iranian Jews and how they came to China, and what, if you're interested in Jewish life at that time in the 40s, it's a wonderful book.
Thank you very much. And this book that I mentioned earlier, Pepper, Silk, and Ivory by Rabbi Marvin Toker, does have a lot about the Kaduris and and the Sassoons as well. Somebody wanted to have the details about the Zoom museum, and I wonder if somebody could repeat that, because I didn't get that written down, or maybe even put it into the chat.
Alan, I think, Alan, can you repeat that? Where this museum,
The Museum of Jewish Heritage, Sunday, the 21st, I believe, 2:00 in the afternoon. So if you just, look up Museum of Jewish Heritage, you'll probably find the link and the registration. In fact, it's been organized to a degree by a man named Jerry Lindenstrauss, who was a German Jew who went to Shanghai and was bar mitzvahed in Shanghai, part of the community, and has been very active in keeping those memories alive. And he's helped organize this exhibit on the 21st.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I'm glad you shared that. I'm thinking that people might be zoomed out. And so I'm going to suggest that if you do have additional questions, that you feel free to send me an email. Again, Physics Rabbi is going to be the words you need to remember. So my email address is physicsrabbi@gmail.com. And you can also go to the website, physicsrabbi.com, for a recording of this, or to the Jewish Center, the Mariches, who sponsored this program. But I appreciate everybody being here. I hope you learned something. I hope I was respectful to our Chinese hosts and our Chinese sponsors for our visit to Beijing. And really, it was a wonderful experience. I can't tell you how much we enjoyed it. It really was thoroughly fascinating. So thank you, and thank you for coming. Thank you to Beverly for organizing this event and for taking all the pictures. Stay safe and stay healthy.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was interesting.
Thank you. Very good. Great.
Very
Thanks,
well
it was
done.
great.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Interesting.
Thank you
I
very much,
enjoyed
Rabbi.
that.
Very,
Thanks.
very intriguing.
Good.
Yep.
Very good.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
Good week.
Okay.
Good Shabbat. Coming.
Yep.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi, again.
Night.
Yes.
Thank you. Bye.